Okay, a brief history of settler colonialism in Canada. Most of us are familiar with the traditional narratives. Once upon a time, North America was basically empty of humans. And some people came across the Bering Land Bridge and started moving across the continent. We call these people Native Americans. Some of them practiced agriculture while others were hunter-gatherers. But then European explorers arrived and discovered the New World. The colonists who came were intrepid adventurers determined to make a new life for themselves through hard work and perseverance. There will often be some mention of Louis Riel after this point, but afterwards, well, there are some variations depending on where went to school. That's an awkward sentence. Native peoples essentially vanished from the narrative. Aside from a short discussion of Louis Riel, Native peoples essentially vanished from the narrative. Well, there are myriad problems with this narrative. The most important part is that it is not accurate. This is the kind of history that results when only sources from settlers are used, and these sources are not integrated regarding their intentions. So what really happened? Here's what we know. Indigenous peoples have lived on Turtle Island, aka what settlers call North America, since a time immemorial. More on this later. The continent was highly populated, the people culturally and ethnically diverse. It was diplomatically complex space inhabited by a wide range of indigenous peoples who had systems of law, trade, and governance. These societies were complex and sophisticated as other societies at the time. After contact, the French and British began to send settlers to what is now Canada. Sorry. In order to benefit from its resources, Britain and France had different approaches to indigenous relocation, but when Britain eventually took over in 1763, British law began to develop different categories that reflected their understanding of race. Through the Indian Act, the Crown divided inhabitants of Canada into two categories: Indigenous people and non-Indigenous settlers. While Turtle Island, prior to contact, was as complex and sophisticated as Europe at the time, the Indian Act negotiated Indigenous diversity and reduced the people of Turtle Island to a category of Indian. By the same mechanism, all non-Indigenous peoples who came to Canada from economic benefit were settlers. Some, though not all, Indigenous groups signed treaties, which constituted agreements that Indigenous and non-Indigenous settlers would share the resources of the land in good faith, that non-Indigenous settlers wouldn't take more than what they needed, and that the relationship would be respectful. However, this isn't what happened. Even after making many agreements, the Crown actively and violently broke its agreements with Indigenous leadership in order to achieve racial and economic dominance and to assimilate Indigenous people into British settler culture. Excerpt tip. A legacy of Canada's settler colonial history is the ways Canadians continue to pay the royal family money. According to the Business Insider, Canada paid the family $20.86 million in 2015, for example, and were and we're just one of the Commonwealth nations who gives them money. The category settler was legally solidified in Canada through the construction of legal binaries developed by the Indian Act. This is not only does being a settler describe a particular history of immigration and economic relationship in Canada, it is also an effect of the law. General guidelines when learning about settler colonialism: do not act out of guilt, but rather out of a genuine interest in challenging the larger oppressive power structures. Understand that they are secondary to the Indigenous people and they are working with and that they seek to serve. They and their needs must take a back seat. Lynn Gal by Ali Bill of Responsibilities. Andrea and Sarah have both been learning and teaching about settler colonialism for several years. The following recommendations are based on our own experiences and a lot of trial and error. We do not wish to present ourselves as experts in this area, nor are these guidelines to be taken as authoritative. Accept that you will make mistakes and upset people as you learn. Accept that you will be corrected by those more knowledgeable than you. Be gracious. Thank your corrector and apply the correction. Do not waste time feeling guilty. This is inherently selfish and does no good. Act instead. Do not burden Indigenous peoples with your feelings. Do not go to them seeking guidance or validation. It is not their job to educate you or make you feel better. Be considerate of the fact that they already carry a heavy burden of emotional labor. Do not add to it. Self-educate. Where do you live? Are you on unceded land? Are you on treaty land? If you're on treaty land, that makes you part of the treaty. Learn what your responsibilities are. If you're on unceded land, look into why it is unceded, what that means, how you can act in solidarity with Indigenous people in your area. Learn the terminology and use it. Do not be afraid to practice in regular conversation. When writing about Indigenous peoples, comply with the following guidelines from the Journalists of Human Rights Indigenous Style Guide. Whenever possible, always be specific about the group, people, community, or nation you are referring to. Defer to the community of individuals' preference on being identified. Otherwise, use correct Indigenous terms for groups, communities, and nations, or example, Kanaka rather than Mohawk. Oh, that's cool. I can't even say it. Kenyan, Kehakan? I think that's how you say it. Avoid saying things like Canada's Indigenous people, Indigenous Canadians, Native Canadians. In general, include an Indigenous person's nation or community in their name. For example, Frank Calder Niska, rather than just Frank Calder. Learn how to properly pronounce Indigenous words and phrases. YouTube can be very helpful for this. I'm just going to slide in there. Also, First Voices is another place that you might be able to find how to say these things. Guidelines and recommendations for teaching about settler colonialism. The same caveats apply here. Allow your Indigenous students to opt out. Not only are they constantly bombarded with this information on a regular basis, but they do not need to be put in a position of teaching their peers about their historic and continued oppression. Keep in mind also that many subjects that are discussed in history classes have personal meaning for many Indigenous students, so it's a good idea to give them a heads up about when you will be discussing these topics, like residential schools or the numbered treaties, and give them permission to miss class if they want. Avoid turning class discussions into both sides debates, especially role-playing court cases. These debates tend to alienate Indigenous students and perpetrate the impacts of settler colonialism. Some good discussions, ground rules that are frequently used in similar contexts include: listen actively, respect others when they are talking, speak from your own experience instead of generalizing, I instead of they, we, and you. Do not be afraid to respectfully challenge one another by asking questions, but refrain from personal attacks. Focus on ideas. Participate to the fullest of your ability. Community growth depends on the inclusion of every individual voice. The goal is not to agree, it is to gain a deeper understanding. It is often helpful to include some kind of warning at the beginning of the lecture, particularly if you come from a marginalized group. For instance, here is one that Andrea uses. You are free to disagree with my comments in this lecture. This lecture is informed by the common consensus among Canadian historians with respect to history of colonialism in Canada, particularly since the publication of the TRC findings. Scholars and the general public alike have been tasked with decolonization. Anticipate that for some students this topic will be emotionally difficult. Make space for all the feelings, good and bad. Provide emotional aftercare, special office hours for people who want to talk, etc. Ground your discussion in the place you live in or teach in. This will help make the topic much more immediate and relevant to your students. Once students have an understanding of what settler colonialism is, have them consider the way it continues in the present. Take care of yourself. Understand that a lot of emotional labor goes into facilitating these necessary and sometimes difficult discussions. These guidelines appear in numerous forms across the internet. We have reproduced them here, but would like to be clear that we did not come up with them. For more information, please go here. Wonder what here is. Oh, that's good. So the next place is awareness activities, which I don't think I will read because that's a lot. I'll stop here before I continue on to students' FAQs and how to answer them.